get started. So about Platypus first. Platypus started in 2006 as a reading group at SAIC in UChicago. Since then, we've established chapters all over the world, including but not limited to New York, Boston, London, Berlin, Jakarta, Tokyo, etc. Platypus is concerned with the problems and tasks inherited from the old, the 1920s and 30s, the new, 60s and 70s, and the post-political, 80s and 90s, left. We are a project dedicated to self-criticism, self-education, and ultimately the practical reconstitution of a Marxian left. At the present, the Marxist left appears as an historical ruin. As critical inheritors of a vanquished tradition, Platypus contends that after numerous failures, we can hardly claim to know the tasks and goals of social emancipation better than those of the past did. In the face of the catastrophic past and present, the first task for the reconstitution of a Marxian left as an emancipatory force is to recognize the reasons for the historical failure of Marxism and to clarify the necessity of a Marxian left for the present and future. The improbable but not impossible reconstitution of emancipatory left is an urgent task. We believe that the future of humanity depends on it. What has the left been and what can it yet become? If the left is to change the world, it must first transform itself. To that end, we run a weekly reading group, which I'll tell you about more at the end. We publish a monthly review, the PR, which is on the table there. And we host public fora on topics relevant to the left. Tonight our topic is the imperialism of the left. So the description was, with the ousting of Morales in Bolivia, political repression in Hong Kong, and rising tensions with Iran, the question of imperialism has posed itself with particular force in the last couple months. Nevertheless, while all three have received much attention from the left, the commonality is not at all clear. What exactly is imperialism, and what constitutes, if at all, effective resistance to it? Finally, how has the left historically understood imperialism, and has that understanding been lost? So I'll introduce our panelists. First, starting from right to left, we have Earl Silbar. Earl Silbar has been a revolutionary socialist communist organizer and activist over the past 50 plus years. Starting from civil rights activity, he helped organize and lead several anti-war committees in Chicago, and then in SDS, and finally joining the Progressive Labor Party. In later years, he participated in anti-racist, anti-fascist organizing, was on several workplace organizing committees, active in Central American Solidarity, and then organized committee for City Colleges of Chicago Adult Educators, where he becomes an active member and leader of their union, AFS CME 3506. Following his retirement, he was a member of the Platypus Study Group for a year in Chicago. In recent years, he has been actively contesting the knee-jerk anti-imperialism of some of the left and working to make clear the common interest of the U.S. working class and oppressed in the U.S. with those in countries the U.S. attacks. He believes that global capitalism is our common enemy and global socialism our common necessity. That the unfolding of disasters of global warming and the growing inter-imperialist rivalry mean that we have literally no time to waste. We then have Lou Sterrett. Lou Sterrett is the treasurer of the Platypus Affiliated Society, a copy editor and distributor of the Platypus Review, and he's also a member of the Northwestern University Platypus chapter. We have Desmond Hui. He is an international student here at UChicago from Hong Kong, as well as member of the Platypus Reading Group. He, as well as some of his friends, have become involved lately in Hong Kong activism and are looking for ways to bring greater attention to prominent activities here in the U.S. Finally, Gregory Lucero. Gregory is a longtime activist who has been part of numerous groups, including as a founding member of the Revolutionary Students' Union and the Utah Anti-War Committee. Upon moving to Chicago, he helped start the Chicago Independent Teamsters and has a long-term commitment to revolution in which he believes Marxism, Leninism, Maoism is essential. So the format will be, they will have opening remarks. It'll be about 8 to 10 minutes. When you have about 1 minute left, I will knock to inform you so that way you'll start to wrap up. After introductory remarks, they'll have about 2 to 4 minutes to respond, and then to each other, and then we will open up to Q&A for anyone who has a question. So with that, if you'd like to start, Earl.
Okay, thank you. The introduction was actually my speech. Thank you very much. That's a joke. So I want to start out with some of my assumptions. First assumption is that imperialism is the competition of capitals to dominate as much of the world's resources, including human resources, as is possible. My second assumption is that it flows necessarily from the inherent nature of capitalism and capital continuing drive to expand and to accumulate. And since capitalism is a global system, we now again see global rivalry. The U.S. hegemony of the 60s and 70s, 80s is over, finished, and new rivals are arriving. And in the early days, in the 60s, it wasn't very easy. It was relatively easy to point out that American imperialism was not only dangerous and harmful to people all over the world, especially in my generation, Vietnam, but that it was also based in the drive of the ruling class to expand its power and its wealth over the world, and hence it was also the enemy of most of the working class in this country. And this was a fundamental distinction within the anti-war movement. There were many who thought that much of the working class in this country had a fundamental interest in maintaining imperialism, the oppression and exploitation of people in countries around the world, and we did not. So we continue to see this, and I hope to get to that later. So the other thing is that if it's true that imperialism is a natural product of capitalist evolution and development, which I think it obviously is, then what are the alternatives? And since imperialism is fundamentally a class strife, but it has racial, religious, national aspects to it, oppression of the Uyghurs in China is not the same as the black experience here, and so on and so forth. But, and I say but, at the root of it, I believe, in Marxism, I think is correct in establishing that fundamentally capitalism is based on the exploitation of wage labor, and that we have a common interest as workers, whether it's intellectual workers, whether it's IT people, whether it's steel workers, we're all directly or indirectly under the control of capital, and therefore we have common interests. We can see that today. I know my time will run out, so let me just check my notes here for a minute. In the 60s, we demonstrated, we being the anti-war movement and the resistance of the Vietnamese who were organized and fought so hard, around the idea that we had a common interest. When there was a military draft, and any young man could be drafted, and therefore any family member could be taken, it was literally a question of life and death, and people were faced with hard decisions. By, I would say, 5 years, from 64 to 69, by 69, 70, the United States military was losing control of its armed forces in Vietnam. The sabotage and the refusal to fight that extended up to killing officers meant that they were afraid of a pre-revolutionary situation, and the Army Investigating Committee said we were losing control by 1970. So to me, this also demonstrated the fact that when push came to shove, ordinary, quote, 18, 19-year-old American guys, overwhelmingly working class, disproportionately people of color, but majority white, were willing to fight against the government to the extent that people were bringing their weapons home and looking for a way to fight the government, which they came to hate, along with their army officers. Not everybody, but extensively. Now, in today's movement, in today's wars, we see a very unhappy, sick, politically disastrous ideology that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So when the U.S. is making warlike moves on Iran, several of the leading anti-war organizations that have led the larger demonstrations have the line that they therefore defend the leadership, the mullahs in Iran, any target of U.S. imperialism, as if there were not competing imperialisms, as if there wasn't different rivalry, as if there weren't other ruling classes oppressing and exploiting their own people, who were rising up And instead of identifying with and trying to build solidarity and show the similarities with, let's say, the recent uprisings that have taken place in Iran, tens of thousands of people in the street, mostly working class this time. The government was afraid for its very existence and had their so-called revolutionary guards, their counter-revolutionary guards, shoot people dead in the streets, perhaps 1,000 or more. So the significance of the enemy, my enemy is my friend, is that it gives rise to a blindness that says all the uprisings against the ruling classes, and I take Iran as, for me, the clearest example. Hong Kong, I'm sure we'll get to discuss, and that would be fascinating. But there are also prophets there, because the anti-war movement and this ideology, when they see people in Hong Kong with American flags, they say, oh, this is a CIA operation. They cannot imagine, which I imagine, if I were in Hong Kong, that it would not be unreasonable to say, well, if China and the U.S. are conflicting, and Chinese government and their way of life is what I don't want for me, then it must be that their enemy can be my friend. Maybe the U.S. can help us somehow. I don't think it's an answer, but it's not unreasonable. Okay. So now we have this inter-imperialist rivalry, and it seems to me that the key question is, with whom are we trying to build solidarity? With whom do we have a common effort? And the question is, basically, is seen in this question of the two-stage revolution is behind it, because it's not just the enemy is my friend. The reality is that the backbone of this, or at least a significant part, are the traditional communist parties of the world. In 2013, there was a letter defending Assad when there were massive killings and bombings going on against the populace in Syria. There was a letter signed by about 130 communist parties, issued in, of all places, in Moscow, explaining why Assad was a defender of civilization, he was anti-imperialist, he was, secularist, and so on. So the reality that these organizations and the people that they work with, and they're very active, their actual politics were Assad is under attack from the U.S., and the Communist Party has influence in the trade unions under Assad and plays a political role in the loyal opposition. And so this is a historical conflict in the left. I am just trying to argue that this question is vital. It's literally a matter of life or not. And I'm just going to take a side. How much time do I have left?
About a minute left.
About a minute left. I just want to throw in a few statistics and then a question to you. The increase in foreign direct investments in the U.S. in 2000, it was on the order of $1.3 trillion, and in 2019 it was $5.955 trillion. I don't have similar statistics for China because I couldn't find articles that gave me that, but the increase, not the base amount, but the increase in foreign direct investments from China has been growing on a steady curve since 2016, 17, 18, 19. And the last 2 quarters there were figures for they increased by 25 billion foreign direct investment. And of course is it called the Silk Road Project? What's that called?
One belt, one road.
One belt, one road, thank you, sorry. In my mind it's the Silk Road Project. That's $1 trillion operation. And it's not just about economics, there's a military aspect to it because this includes loaning money to build ports and roads to ports that can be used as naval. They're establishing a corridor with Myanmar that will take them out to the ocean and they won't have to go through to set up ports, to set up bases. This is the rising competition that I'm talking about. And to leave it there, I want to ask a question for people in the audience. Is there something about capitalism and imperialism that you find to be emancipatory. Because it's a confusion that I have with Platypus. It's my confusion, but I keep hearing it, and so I thought this would be a place, since there are Platypus people and friends here, to ask that. The only last point I would have is that unless we have organizations that are dedicated to working with working class people and developing the concrete reality of common interests and the necessity of banding together and being supportive of each other to overthrow capitalism wherever it's weaker, we will have no hope. And if climate change isn't enough, we're under a real time deadline here. We don't have a lot of time. That's it.
Thank you. Lou?
Sure. Okay. The title of my talk is Imperialism, How Does It Task Us? Imperialism, as it was grasped by the best Marxist theory of the Second and Third Internationals, and even by many bourgeois theorists, definitively came into its own at the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century. Imperialism's emergence and the understanding of it gives us a look into the crisis of the Second International and its subsequent split. This characteristic of imperialism as a lens for understanding the left's capabilities in theory and practice continues to this day. Karl Kautsky, the leading theoretician of the Second International after the death of Engels, defined imperialism thus, quote, "Imperialism is a product of highly developed industrial capitalism. It consists in the striving of every industrial capitalist nation to bring under its control and to annex increasingly big agrarian regions, irrespective of what nations inhabit those regions," end quote. For Lenin, this was an inadequate definition, as it reduced imperialism to a matter of state policy regarding territories. It was not a matter of new policies, but that of the, quote, transformation of competition into monopoly, which is one of the most important, if not the most important, phenomena of the modern capitalist economy. If Kautsky's definition is inadequate, let us look to Lenin's definition. And this is a long quote. He writes, "We have seen that the economic quintessence of imperialism is monopoly capitalism. This very fact determines its place in history, for monopoly that grew up on the basis of free competition, and precisely out of free competition, is the transition from the capitalist system to a higher socio-economic order. We must take special note of the four principal forms of monopoly, or the four principal manifestations of monopoly capitalism, which are characteristic of the epoch under review. Firstly, monopoly arose out of the concentration of production at a very advanced stage of development. This refers to the capitalist combines, cartels, syndicates, and trusts. Secondly, monopolies have accelerated the capture of the most important sources of raw materials. Thirdly, monopoly has sprung from the banks. Fourthly, the monopoly has grown out of colonial policy. To the numerous old motives of colonial policy, finance capital has added the struggle for the sources of raw materials, for the export of capital, for spheres of influence, i.e. for spheres of profitable deals, concessions, monopolist profits, and so on. And final, for economic territory in general. Lenin adds also that imperialism's, quote, intensification of contradictions constitutes the most powerful driving force of the transitional period of history, which began from the time of the definitive victory of world finance capital, end quote. The emphasis on history comes about because it is understood as the time of the unfolding of freedom. Now, is Lenin against imperialism, or is he doing something more? In doing a critique of both Kautskyan theory and imperialism itself, Lenin emphasized this transformed quality because it also pointed to new conditions of possibility, necessity, and desirability for freedom and transformation. This attention to the question of freedom is one that has been lost in the last century of consciousness for the left, often sidelined by the question of justice. Lenin writes, "Capitalism in its imperialist stage arrives at the threshold of the most complete socialization of production. In spite of themselves, the capitalists are dragged, as it were, into a new social order, a a transitional social order from complete free competition to complete socialization. Production becomes social, but appropriation remains private. The social means of production remain the private property of a few, end quote. This most complete socialization of production is bound up with the contradictions from which it emerged, namely that of bourgeois social relations and industrial forms of production. Marxism's concern with the negative conception of class of the proletariat has to do with its embodiment of this contradiction. If the commodity form in contradiction can be made conscious, it could push this contradiction, adjudicate it politically, and overcome itself as a class. Imperialism's complete socialization of society forms a totality that is both true and false. On the bank's attempt to gain economic advantage through various spheres, Lenin writes, the result is twofold. On the one hand, the merging to an ever greater extent, or as Bukharin aptly calls it, the coalescence of bank and industrial capital, and on the other hand, a transformation of the banks into institutions of a truly, quote, universal character, end quote. So this universal character of banks, which is noted by Marx as giving, quote, the form, but only the form, of socialized production, is the other dialectical side of capitalism's antinomy of capital and labor. The instinct of the banks to attain the greatest economic advantage by grasping as many spheres as possible is an opaque symptom of the necessity of the proletariat's political and economic leadership of society, and thus also the overcoming of the proletariat through its own leadership. The class standpoint of the bourgeoisie is inadequate to the task. Despite the greatest efforts in science on the part of the bourgeoisie, society remains blind to itself so long as the proletariat does not lead it. This is due to the proletariat's unique standpoint and historical mission. Lenin attacks Kautsky's renegacy on the point of imperialist socialization because Kautsky stops short here, instead promoting an ultra-imperialist peace under capitalism. Georg Lukács, in attempting to learn from Rosa Luxemburg and Lenin, writes, quote, bourgeois thought remains fixated on these forms which it believes to be immediate and original, and from there it attempts to seek an understanding of economics, blithely unaware that the only phenomenon that has been formulated is its own inability to comprehend its own social foundations. Whereas for the proletariat, the way is open to a complete penetration of the forms of reification. It achieves this by starting with what is dialectically the clearest form, the immediate relation of capital and labor. It then relates this to those forms that are more remote from the production process, and so includes and comprehends them too in the dialectical totality. The task of leading society through this form of socialization is later addressed by Leon Trotsky. When anticipating the cries of protest from capitalists that they will hand over their ledgers and bookkeeping for inspection to prove the impossibility of the demands of the proletariat, Trotsky writes, quote, no office holder of the bourgeois state is in a position to carry out this work, no matter with how great authority one wished to endow him. All the world was witness to the impotence of President Roosevelt and Premier Bloom against the plottings of the 60 or 200 families of their respective nations. To break the resistance of the exploiters, the mass pressure of the proletariat is necessary. The working out of even the most elementary economic plan from the point of view of the exploited, not the exploiters, is impossible without workers' control, that is, without the eyes of the workers penetrating all the open and concealed mechanisms of capitalist economy, end quote. The problem is not one of policy of the capitalists, but rather that of politics. In other words, it is not a question of what to do, but who does it. Thus, the capitalists have ripened the fruit of society to the point that it is ready for the taking. So long as it is not taken, so long as it becomes overripe, society will continue to suffer from its own unrealized potential. With the breakdown in the World Revolution, which started in 1917, the proletariat's action as becoming a class for itself dissolves again into a class in itself. The lack of a real socialist party that grapples with the world has implications for the appearance of society in total, including the consciousness of the proletariat, which breaks down into an antinomy of theory and practice, or theoryism and actionism. In the middle of the 20th century, Max Horkheimer, in conversation with Theodor Adorno, notes that the appearance of the object fundamentally changes without a political party that can offer such leadership. He writes, we have asked that the relationship between theory and practice, we have asked about the relationship of theory, between theory and practice if there is no longer a party. Now there is no party, and this means that two sources of uncertainty are involved if we continue to operate in the realm of theory. Firstly, because what is produced in the way of theory no longer has anything in common with Marx, with the most advanced class consciousness. Our thoughts are no longer a function of the proletariat. Secondly, it seems then as if we are working on a theory for keeping in stock. End quote. The best of the Frankfurt School dealt with the depth of the problem with an honesty that seems vacant in today's dead left. The lack of a real party brings proletarian consciousness to a standstill that cannot be overcome with a waving away of the historical problems that the present has inherited. The Platypus-affiliated society held its first public forum almost 13 years ago to the day on the topic of imperialism, offering us a view of the recent left's approach to the phenomenon. On that panel, Chris Coutron said that, quote, the left has lost its basic orientation towards freedom, a problem going back at least as far as the 1930s. The perspective the left once had on the question and problem of freedom has been occluded in the present, end quote. To this, Adam Turrell of the now defunct International Socialist Organization responded, quote, I think the left has more to do than examine our mistakes and despair. The left is about a process taking place in society, about people radicalizing and struggling against injustice, end quote. Dismissing history leads to a false mediation and leaves the present to drown in its own opacity. When one reads Lenin's words that, quote, imperialism is the eve of the proletarian social revolution, this has been confirmed since 1917 on a worldwide scale, end quote, one feels a distance between today and a century ago. This is not simply a temporal distance, but one that registers the deep historical regression that few want to accept. If, as Marx wrote, the world has been dreaming and it need only awaken itself, then today one gets the feeling that the left is stuck in its daydreams about this dreaming world.
Okay, so I'd like to start off by saying that I'm going to be quite humble. I'm like a U-Chicago student like basically all of you, and the only reason I'm here is because I'm from Hong Kong and I've been involved in the current Hong Kong movement. I'm sure I lack much of the Marxist communist expertise that the other panelists have, but I hope my main purpose here is to bring attention to issues in Hong Kong and ultimately, subsequently, in China. So first of all, since this talk is about imperialism after all, I want to stage a question about what is imperialism, of course, that we brought up consistently. But then I'd like to start off by saying what is not imperialism, right? Or what is not the ending of imperialism? And what is not the ending of imperialism is the hoisting of a new flag, right? Of tearing down the colonial flag, and you think that imperialism is over. Because to me, at least from my own experience in Hong Kong, imperialism goes much, much deeper than that. It's precisely the structures, the political and social structures, which persist even after a new flag is hoisted. So then I have a quote, a very intelligent quote for you by a very intelligent guy, Frantz Fanon, from The Wretched of the Earth. Nationalism is not a program. A government needs a program if it really wants to liberate the people politically and socially. Not only an economic program, but also a policy on the distribution of wealth and social relations. Okay, so why exactly am I talking about this? Because when I read stuff like this, it reminds me precisely about Hong Kong. 1997, turnover of Hong Kong back to China. You hoist a new flag. The Chinese government says, oh, everyone's liberated. Oh, what a great time. But is this really the case? And you especially see this now in their contemporary rhetoric, right? Like, for example, Geng Shuang, the U.S. the foreign minister for China at the moment. Whenever he talks about the Hong Kong protests and he talks about U.S. politicians mentioning the Hong Kong protests, he says stuff like, the U.S. should, quote, respect China's sovereignty. So he especially phrases, repressing the protests as a means, as an anti-imperial program, right? As a means of protecting the sovereignty of the country. Well, to me, this is completely ridiculous because it is precisely China that has maintained those social and political policies in Hong Kong, which has devastated the people. Now, what exactly am I talking about? We may have this conception about China being communist, and of course, I'm sure all of you have had these little debates, oh, is China really communist? But for sure in Hong Kong, there's not even a debate to be had. For example, Xu Jiaotun, forgiving my Mandarin is not very competent. He was the head of Xinhua News up until the Hanover. He said that the essence of the future Hong Kong people ruling Hong Kong arrangement is a cross-class united government under the leadership of capitalists. So what we see in Hong Kong is the most immense inequality and the most pro-business government probably across the entire world. I'm sure you've all heard about how Hong Kong has one of the highest level Gini coefficients, measure of inequality, in the entire world. 1 in 5 Hong Kongers live in poverty. You hear about these cage homes, you hear about these high housing prices. So the Hong Kong government says, we're anti-imperial, we've liberated Hong Kong people from the British. But really, when I look around in Hong Kong, I don't see this liberation at all. It's complete crap. They've continued precisely the British colonial system, which I personally despise. Well, we all despise, right? So then, and of course, we also have to say that even though China brings out this rhetoric constantly about how they're so anti-imperial, how they're actually affirming China's sovereignty, they also infringe constantly on Hong Kong's law. They have the final say. The National People's Congress has the right to interpret basic law, which is essentially the Hong Kong Constitution. So any law that gets passed has to be affirmed ultimately by the Chinese government. You have these stories about people being kidnapped and brought to China and tortured. So, for example, Simon Chung, who was a UK consulate worker over the protests in August, he was brought to Shenzhen. He got the crap beaten out of him, and of course, these mainland officials were questioning him. Oh, why is Britain funding the protests? Why is the UK funding these protests? Color revolutions, all of that. And of course, 3 years ago, 5 booksellers who distributed anti-CCP propaganda were also kidnapped. I'm sure you've heard about it before. And of course, I also want to, on this point about emphasizing the threat of China, how Chinese claims of anti-imperialism are actually just a new imperialism in disguise. We've already brought up this One Belt, One Road situation. Massive investments in Africa, in Eastern Europe. Sure, they do improve public infrastructure, things like that, but then they're also creating a new form of debt bondage, especially in Africa, where African countries are so reliant economically on China that they virtually have no way to resist any CCP political program. And of course, we've all heard about, especially on American news, Xinjiang. 1.5 million Uyghurs are currently arrested or imprisoned, at least according to estimations. And they keep them in camps and they sing these sing these patriotic songs, like 没有共产党就没有新中国. It's basically song. It basically propagandized completely. Okay, forgive me for being incoherent here. I'm basically like you, right? Like the only reason I'm here is because I'm from Hong Kong. So why do I view Hong Kong as really, really important, or the current movement in Hong Kong as really, really important? Because if the current movement in Hong Kong cannot succeed, this really does not bode well for the rest of China. So I mean, we're Hong Kongers, and we might call ourselves, have a separate Hong Kong local identity, which is separate from most of mainland China. But ultimately, the conditions that we have grown up in are precisely that of Chinese conditions, like Confucian culture, our family units, our family bonds. And if this movement in Hong Kong cannot succeed in bringing democracy, it will really not bode well for the rest of China about how things will turn out in the long term, or whether the CCP's totalitarian rule can be ended. And of course, I would also like to bring up the fact that many people have talked about, I'm sure if you're a leftist, you might have argued about whether Hong Kong actually has fascist or maybe naive. They might be aligning with the U.S., so they're not really emancipatory. Well, first I want to dispel any notions that the Hong Kong movement is specifically a localist, or rather a racist movement that simply are against our anti-mainland Chinese. Like Hong Kong independence, for example, is the main policy program of people who are localists, who are just racist against mainland Chinese, and only 5% of Hong Kongers at this moment believe Hong Kong independence is a feasible option for Hong Kong. So it's a very, very minority opinion. But then even then, we have to realize that the Hong Kong people are not how you say, are not truly, they're not truly anti-communist. They might say these type of anti-leftist words, slogans, but that's mainly because of a history of anti-leftism in Hong Kong. Virtually the entire population of Hong Kong are refugees running from the Cultural Revolution, running from the Great Leap Forward. They have really, I can talk to my own grandmother, and she tells me about the poverty in southern China at the time. And it's simply because of this history that they're against anti-communism. It's not truly an ideology that has concretely developed. So there is massive potential in Hong Kong for the formation of a left, which is my dream at least, for genuine, strong, authentic left in Hong Kong. And it is, and things like this are happening. There are leftist political circles, political groups in Hong Kong that are attempting to take this movement into a more revolutionary organization. And of course, indeed, it is precisely the way Hong Kongers oppose China that they're actually moving towards more leftist solutions at the very moment. For example, people have been calling for a general strike in Hong Kong for the past, essentially since the movement started. And they've, and as a result, things like trade unions, these organizations have actually increased significantly, simply because to bring more pressure upon the government. Okay, so I've talked a lot. I've strayed too far from the situation about imperialism, but I'll try to rate it back upon here. So to close, I guess I would like to say that imperialism, if you bring anything away, imperialism is not merely the hoisting of a new flag. It is concrete political and social programs, political social solutions to current problems. China is a threat, or at least do not be fooled by Chinese claims of anti-imperialism, because according to this definition of imperialism, concretely speaking, they are a growing imperialist threat. Of course, this does not mean that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Does not mean we should support the U.S. But at least we should be very aware, very cognizant of this problem. And don't turn your backs on us Hong Kongers, right? We can be a bit looking down on mainland Chinese sometimes. We can be pro-U.S. at times, but then ultimately, if you can't win in Hong Kong, if the left cannot gain influence in a place as destructively neoliberal as Hong Kong, it frankly cannot win anywhere. So I guess that's what I'll end with.
Yeah. Well. Oh, not yet.
Oh, okay.
But I'll cue. So I'm very flattered that I get to be part of this panel, and I will talk a little bit about anti-war movement. But some things, and maybe this is rehashing for many of you, but basically there's an understanding that I think we need to move from. What is capitalism? What is imperialism? There are many views on this, on just this panel alone. I'm going to give a very, very basic introduction to what we mean by saying imperialism. I'm a Marxist-Leninist Maoist. Imperialism is Leninist. It gets thrown around all the time nowadays. And actually, it gets thrown around because of the 60s and 70s, that anti-imperialism just became a term for I don't like what the U.S. is doing X place. So I'm going to actually talk about imperialism itself, going off Lenin's understanding of it, and yeah. So if you can, let's see if I can do this without my notes. So the first thing is the Marxist theory of value. And what's really important is it's not a simple breakdown of workers good, bosses bad. That is true, but it goes into more depth. So just in any society, you have three basic inputs. You have labor, the means of production, that's your factories, your farms, your whatevers, and then the raw resources that are required to use it. However, under capitalism, there is surplus value. And it's a very difficult term. the easiest, and this is not correct, but the easiest way to explain it is profit. That the capitalists, it costs them X number of labor hours, it costs X for the machines, the factories, and it costs X to get the resources into it. And then they charge you, again, I'm very, very much paraphrasing, and obviously it's much more in depth, but then they charge more than it costs them, and they pocket the gains. That's profit, give or take. Now, one thing that happens is originally you make a commodity and you sell a commodity to get another commodity. So here I have a book, because I like books. So if I was, I don't know, a bookseller, let's just say, I would sell it to get money, and what would I use that money for? I would use it to buy essentials, food, clothing, whatever. However, under capitalism, there's a new form, which is the capitalist has the money first, they buy the commodity, or sell it, or produce it, or whatever, for the sake of more money. And this money is not the same amount that they started with. This is profit, hence the little surplus value. And also you can see with capitalist relations, they're darkened because it's visually interesting and the extent of my skill on that. Okay, so this is very roughly basic Marxism. Basic. I'm not saying it's accurate 100%, but if you want a 3-minute thing on Marxism, that's that. But then Lenin comes around, and he notices that whereas Marx, the key is the factory, the production, Lenin begins to notice that there's actually banks start becoming more and more prevalent. And what you have is you have workers and capitalists, they start putting their money into the banks. The yellow line, of course, being exploitation, and then, of course, the normal line just being whatever. So these banks have all this money that's just sitting there. And they found that not everybody takes money from the bank all at once, all at the exact same time, so that they then understood that they can invest this. They invest this money in the means of production or whatever. They buy factories, they buy farms, whatever. And this is the basic form that it takes, but it also has something unique that happens, which is the first, well, I won't get into the first world, third world distinction, but the rich nations begin investing. They still have their industries, they invest in those, but also they begin buying up third world banks. And what do these third world banks do? They also have factories that also exploit workers. So then they're not only making money off their workers at home, they're making money off the banks that are making money off the factories that are making more money off the workers abroad. And that's basic imperialism. All right, so we can cut this because I'm going to look at my notes and I want to surprise you all. Okay, this is the basic understanding of Marxism-Leninism, which is essential to understanding what we mean by imperialism. Frequently, everyone talks about imperialism. If any of you went, I did, to the giant protest Trump and his war in Iran. It had like 20,000 people, give or take. They say they don't want the war. But there's a few problems with this. They use the word imperialism, and maybe some of them mean it in the Leninist sense, but basically they've substituted the actual economic relations for the political term. Imperialism is bad, imperialists are bad, but they don't actually ask themselves, what are we talking about in imperialists? And if they ask themselves that, frequently, many people would not get farther than, oh, that's bad. So that sucks. And it actually shows an incredible weakness in the left. And I'll get to why I think that started. But there's three forms of intervention. In Iran, it's direct intervention. Iraq War, direct intervention. Afghanistan, direct intervention. However, as the Iraq and Afghanistan war taught the ruling class, that's not a very profitable way to do things, and it costs a lot of money, and you don't really get as much of a return. Halliburton profits notwithstanding, you don't actually get much of a return on this invading, massive force, massive bombing, etc., etc. They're still doing it. Again, Iran is a clear example, but they have better ways. That leads us to neocolonialism. Colonialism, of course, is, roughly speaking, when Europe colonized everywhere. And then a clear example is Cecil Rhodes in Africa. He would exploit and pillage, and they would ship the stuff back to England. That's basic colonialism. The problem with that was, generally, people don't like strange foreigners who don't speak their language coming into their country and killing all of them. So, and it's a long process, but roughly in the 40s to 80s, maybe a little later, but roughly that period, they formulated a policy which was neocolonialism. And in that, what you do is you don't take over vast swaths of land. You get your guy who does whatever you want to be in charge, and then from there you just get him to do all that stuff. And so that's neocolonialism. It's happening right now. In Hong Kong, you have an indirect intervention by the United States, and National Endowment for Democracy notwithstanding, some of their leaders take money from it. That's more direct, but in fact, the U.S.'s role in these protests, as my colleague here said, is very hands-off. It's there, but you should also realize there are some of these indirect actions in which we in imperialist nations need to be cognizant. So what are the effects of the anti-war movement? First off, and most key, there is basically no anti-war movement. And the reason why, as Earl said earlier, was because of the draft. It was hugely unpopular. And you're going some other foreign place to kill other foreign people so rich people can get more from you and from your family and, whatever, didn't really appeal to them. And so they took some protests, like fragging their COs, which is you throw a grenade into the CO's tent while they're sleeping, and it blows up and kills them. And the ruling elite realized, we can't keep going with this. This is not going to work. And so now we have a professional army of mercenaries. Just really quick, the anti-war movement then is it's a secretive kind of thing that, if you really know, you'd really become communist. I think that's a bad approach, and that's what they've been doing since the end of the draft. The radicalization of anti-war movement for revolution, while I'm all for that, it should be explicit. It should be clear. And if you want to see imperialism get defeated, look at Iraq and Afghanistan. We are not in solidarity with Iraq and Afghanistan, although I went to every anti-war protest. I called most anti-war protests. But the fact of the matter is, it was Iraqi blood, Afghani blood, and bullets that drove out the American mercenaries, or the U.S. Army, whichever one how you want to call it. So this is key. Key. The main enemy is at home. Assad's a piece of shit. I'll just say it. In Hong Kong, there are real legitimate concerns that really need to be addressed. But for us, in the US, here, who live here, who are citizens, the main enemy is always at home. And that, I think, is the key point. And thank you so much.
We'll now open up for 1 to 4 minute responses. So it sort of reflects you out on other panelists, and if you start to go near the 4 minute mark, I'll again do a little knock to warn you. Would you like to start, Earl, or?
Well, I had a question about Hong Kong. What would success mean?
Should I?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, what would success mean?
Oh, success.
Yeah.
I mean, if you ask the Hong Kong protesters, there's something called 5大收考, which is 5 demands, which is independent commission on the police, which is ending a right characterization for the protesters, amnesty for all arrested protesters, full universal suffrage, and let me think, right characterization for. Did I say independent commission?
Yeah,
I believe I said.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. Okay. Right, June 12th. I said there was a June 12th. No, investigation on like these triads, like they're gangsters who had attacked the
Yes.
protesters. But if you ask me, I would say that there needs to be more class organization. For example, there needs to be more labor organization, because ultimately, what these protesters want, if you truly ask them and you push them and say, why exactly would democracy benefit Hong Kong? They'll say, if I have democracy, then I can vote on the housing prices, things like this, right? This is their ultimate goal. It's not merely to protect Hong Kong from China, but also for these livelihood concerns. And in my opinion, if those livelihood concerns get fulfilled, that to me would be the ultimate victory.
So that's maybe a lot of the motivation, but that's not what the demands are. That's not the goals that they're articulating.
Yes. The explicit demands are
Those
the ones I
5.
just outlined, yes.
So so there's nothing really about changing the ownership of property relations, of having public housing, and so on and so forth. It's not. It hasn't emerged as a demand.
No, sorry, if I may speak, I'll just take 1 minute to explain things. For the Hong Kong Parliament, there are 35, half the seats in the Hong Kong Parliament are only voted for by business interests. So only if you have corporations, for example, can vote for these seats. So if there was democracy, immediately business interest in the state, for example, would be completely removed. So in a sense, asking for democracy is directly shutting down the power of capitalist large business organizations. Although I can't tell you for certain that's the driving motivation, but at least that specific demand for democracy is a class-based demand.
Thank you.
Earl, I wonder if my presentation answered your question at the end of your presentation. To like maybe restate an answer for it right now, it would be there's both simultaneously an emancipatory character and a destructive character. In the same way that one might say that, in the way that like Luxembourg thought that World War I was the crisis that had been pushed for by the Second International, and at the same time, came to create oceans of blood. Right now, I don't think imperialism is imperialism itself will not emancipate society. However, it has created the preconditions of the complete socialization of society, and especially this concentration of production and finance capital provides immense potential. Of course, that remains up to the proletariat to grasp and take the roles in the state. Smash. Sorry, I don't mean to kind of go on, but it's just that a potential that, as I said, if this potential is not taken, we will suffer from it, as we have been suffering from it. My question, just a quick question from Greg. I know you were trying to give a very quick kind of
Yes.
rundown of Marx and then Marx and then Lenin, I just wanted to know if there is a Maoist kind of there's an additional kind of Maoist piece, at least with regard to understanding imperialism.
There isn't, and I'll just explicitly say that. This is basic Marxism-Leninism that would be found in, Answer, PSL, ISO, or whatever its book wing is. The Maoism is actually after you establish the state. Marx talked about the need for revolution, but Lenin actually did it. Lenin talked about the withering of the state. There was an attempt to do it under Mao that was ultimately defeated. And, I think the People's Republic of China is socialist, but they're socialist like the Soviet Union was in 1984. So it would take very little for them to flip and just say, oh yeah, just kidding, we're all actually just straight up capitalists now. They still do execute a lot of billionaires, which I think is good, but that's a holdover of Maoism that they haven't been able to erase yet. Does that make sense?
I'd like to reiterate again that my expertise is very low, so I apologize if I don't make many insightful comments, but I first like to reiterate a point that was brought up earlier. Like I fully agree with that. Enemy of my enemy is not my friend, right? And this goes both ways. So for me in Hong Kong, simply because the U.S. opposes China does not mean that we should align with the U.S. And if you live in the U.S., simply because China opposes the U.S. does not mean you should support China. All these things obscure a real emancipatory solution, which is precisely, like as we reiterated, building a proletarian base, actually fighting for what's good rather than constantly compromising. Good God. Okay, sorry. But then if I have a question for Greg, just very quickly, you mentioned earlier that you thought that the U.S. has an indirect influence on Hong Kong. I mean, besides the national endowment, blah, 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 of course.
Yeah.
Could you articulate what you meant by that?
Yeah, I think that several. Okay, let me be very clear. I'm not familiar intimately with the situation of Hong Kong, and I completely defer to your judgment. But I do know the leaders who get put on American television, and they may not be the real leaders. I don't know, and I'm skeptical of them anyway. But the reason they're chose to be the leaders is because they are in many cases directly being funded by the U.S. government, and that's not like abstract. Just look for the National Endowment or for Democracy or whatever. You can find it. They pay them. It's on their tax returns, and they're a 401 or C or whatever. They're a nonprofit, and so it's on there. Those people get a lot of screen time. The housing doesn't get addressed. The mass inequality doesn't get addressed. The fact that essentially, I hate to say this, but there's 50% of corporate leadership doesn't get addressed. But they're fighting for democracy, and that's what you turn on CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, and that's what they'll say. So does that distinction make sense?
Okay, yeah, if you have that.
No, I was just going to respond to Greg's point.
Oh, go for it.
Yeah, go.
So, just to reiterate, Greg asked me if his presentation answered my question, which was,
Oh, that's Lou, sorry. Greg's at the end.
Oh, I'm sorry.
That's all right.
So Lou,
See?
answer your
Yeah.
A word to the wise. Don't get older. However, it's still better than the alternative I'm aware of. So you asked me if your presentation basically laid out a way for me to see what you're talking about, emancipatory. So what I got out of that was that the extreme centralization of control of production, especially as seen in the financial arrangements, lays the basis for where it's kind of like laying your hands upon a ready-made work, so to speak. In other words, there's national and international organizations of production, corporations and banks, which are obviously also corporations. And the idea is that, therefore, the connections are already made. It's just a matter of the working class taking over these structures and making them ours and putting different priorities and different methods into place. But the structures are there. Is that what you're saying? Something like that?
Perhaps, although the taking of it would qualitatively change what it means, and I would also say that the bourgeois state differs fundamentally from the proletarian state in that the proletarian state, its goal is to wither itself away, yeah, in that sense, yeah.
Once upon a time, when I was a wee young'un, we would read, I think it was Lenin, who was talking about like taking over institutions of the state, like postal service, the things that are not directly economic, but that structures existed. And I think I understand what you're saying. I think it's true that capitalism provides the basis for not only its demise, but for the end of a class system in the sense of the working class. We're putting ourselves out of a job, not being controlled by others, but taking control, which totally changes everything. I'm not sure I'm persuaded that, I'll say what I do think. I do think that the real bonds will come from developing class-centered but not class-limited movements and organizations in different countries, for example, like the US and China, and engaging in domestic struggles against our own ruling classes and the state, and establishing practical and ideological solidarity with our brothers and sisters in other countries facing exploitation by capital. More so than taking over existing institutions. In other words, it's a view. It's like, what would be an example of that? We don't have too many good examples. If, let's say, some radical American workers existed and were organized and sent a delegation to meet with Chinese workers and radicals, whether in Hong Kong or wherever they could arrange these meetings, and establish links. There's a group that I'm a part of, tiny little part of, called the Railroad Workers United. They have a website. It's not a revolutionary group, but their idea is to bring together railroad workers in North and South America to support each other in the struggle against privatization and the various things, and one-man trains and dangerous conditions that all railroad workers face. And they have established contact with railroad workers in South Korea, Japan, and China. These are not taking over capitalist institutions. These are forging relationships of solidarity based on people's understanding and consciousness. And I believe this is the way that we will actually rebuild and build a new world. Maybe that helps it, rather than being critical. That's what I do think. And my experience in life, limited though it might be, is that it's possible to touch those chords and to do this. And I don't see any alternative. I think it's the most emancipatory project that is imaginable, at least to me. And I think that Marx shared it. Are you familiar with the recent writings by Peter Hudis, Hudis? I encourage you to read it. He goes to some length to explain from Marx the vision that the alternative, the dialectical working out of capital-labor contradiction, is in the sense of the actual process of actual participation, not being handed, it's like, okay, here you're free. No, that isn't how freedom happens. Anyway, I'll leave it at that. If you're interested, go look up Peter Hudis. It's online, it's on Facebook, it's wherever you want it. It's a good job, I think.
Remarks from Greg, and then we'll open the Q&A. If you have one.
I don't know. I think most people got it. I do have a question for you. And first off, one, why do you keep being like, well, I don't know as much. Hey, I'm a dirty teamster working at UPS. You know just as much as anybody else up here. So one is, why do you keep doing that? Two, what do you think can be the role, or is there a role that the U.S. that people in the U.S. can do to support China, keeping in mind, of course, the question of how is the story set in the U.S. It's U.S. is causing stuff and doing whatever. What would be some concrete things for us to do?
You didn't mean support China, you meant support Hong Kong.
If you
Correct?
Yeah, I mean...
Oh, I'm sorry, maybe you did mean that.
Well, here's the thing. No offense, Hong Kong's part of China. So, yes, it's supporting China, but it's also supporting Hong Kong. Just like I support national liberation for Chicanos, but also I support any LA riots. So, it's similar. But in any case, does that question make sense?
Sure. I'll try to keep it quick to move to the Q&A. I apologize because, frankly, I'm a first-year student. I don't feel I'm very appropriate here. I just have hands-on experience protesting in Hong Kong. I don't have the knowledge base that I'm sure many of you have.
You have a different knowledge base, my friend.
Sure.
Yeah, and that was my first question.
Sure.
When are you going to stop doing that?
Okay, right, okay. Anyway, I'll keep it quick. On this topic of what U.S. people can do, to be perfectly honest, I don't think that U.S. citizens can do much. I think the real battle is for Hong Kongers and Chinese to actually emancipate themselves, right? Nobody can do it for them. You can only do it for yourselves. But in terms of what you can do, resist any messaging, resist like this total dichotomy between U.S. and China, constantly bring this home that these are not the only two alternatives. Resist any anti-Chinese messages, especially with Trump tariffs, right? Huawei supposedly, well, perhaps, but then, this is not, we shouldn't fall into narratives of anti-Chinese narratives. So the main struggle for U.S. people is precisely to resist narratives. And the main struggle for us, Hong Kongers and Chinese, is to fight for freedom, as they say in Hong Kong, is a chant.
So are you basically saying that whether I live in China or Iran or here, the main enemy is at home?
I would say, the main enemy is in China, at least in terms of China. But then the main thing that you can do in the U.S. is precisely at home, because you're only at home. So that's why I would say.
Well, why don't we go ahead and open to Q&A for anyone who has any questions, comments, questions. In the back.
Yes. I have a question for Mr. Hui. So I really appreciate your sharing of the knowledge about Hong Kong, and I'm very interested in the joint argument made by all the panelists that the enemy of my enemy isn't necessarily my friend. I'm very interested in how Mr. Hui responds to Mr. Lucero's argument that there are subtle foreign involvements both from China and from the United States in Hong Kong. How would Mr. Hui think that the best balance point between a democracy and foreign involvement be in Hong Kong?
Well, sorry to apologize again, but then I think I just realized that there might be a problem. Hong Kong monopolizing the discussion. Of course, the situation in Hong Kong is quite bad. Like more than 16,000 canisters of tear gas, but people get shot in the street in Iraq, for example, in Ecuador. But then the U.S. media doesn't report it. So I am fully aware. I don't want anyone to go back with the impression that Hong Kong is all that matters. It's not all that matters. It's just simply important to me. But moving on to your question, in terms of foreign involvement, I'm assuming you mean should we be scared of foreign involvement? Is that what you mean?
How should we find the balance point between listening to the people's opinions and being aware of the imperialistic components?
You mean which people's? You mean Hong Kong people's opinion?
Yes, what do you think is the best solution as of the current Hong Kong situation?
Like, should we listen to Hong Kong people's opinion? Should we be scared of people manipulating Hong Kong people's opinion? Is that what you mean?
I'm interested in your opinion about this.
Yeah. I think it is a problem that many Hong Kong people fall into a narrative, like we've already discussed, and to keep it brief. But then we should also be aware that Hong Kong people also watch the news, right? They're people like everyone else. Many people I know, they don't like Trump, because they see him on the news. He says some stupid crap again, and then they're like, "Oh my God, this guy's a complete dumbass! Jesus Christ!" But of course, they have to. I mean, Joshua Wong, that one of the very prominent pro-democracy leaders. He has like a video saying, "Okay, so we have to get Congress to pass a law, but then there's this idiot Trump who's the president, and we have to convince him. Like, it's not like we worship even people who are pro-U.S. in Hong Kong. It's not like they worship U.S. right? They simply say, oh, the U.S. is a stupid giant, but it's a giant nonetheless. So we have to rely on them. So I mean, sorry, I'm already straying away from your question. But then foreign involvement, I don't think we should resist it, but don't get the impression that it's simply a U.S. plot or anything like that.
Yeah.
So you asked a question from him about what can people in the United States do to help people in Hong Kong, and he answered perfect answer that it's nothing. Everything that's going to be solved in Hong Kong has to be solved by people of Hong Kong, and has to be done as an inside, job. And I think as a Persian, I think that exactly holds true for Iran, and that. With all the problems that, the government of Iran has, he mentioned one of them at the start of the panel, but I still think any type of, any type of involvement of the outside, of the foreign governments in the matter of how things are run in Iran, it's kind of discombobulates people's momentum to kind of, because especially just before the killing of the general, people were rising and were very aggressive towards the government. And the government was under a lot of pressure to kind of make sure that because people were not happy because of the financial situations. And then when that happened, the government gained some momentum, and then it was disrupted accidentally by the plane crash and everything. So I think this is a clear example of how, foreign government being involved inside a country can kind of help the government rather than, help the people.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't hear a question, so I'm going to respond to that. Unless you have something specific or.
No. That was a comment.
Okay, no, that's fine. I'm not like, you need a question at the end.
Yeah.
Here's something that the left in this country don't like to say, and I'll just say it. Assad, he's a worthless fucking piece of shit. Okay?
Yeah, but why don't you tell us what you really think?
I'm at this panel, and I'm just trying to keep things very calm.
Because we're all quiet.
Yeah. But here's the thing. I literally started protests against any U.S. intervention in Iran, sorry, Freudian slip, in Syria. It's not because, and this is something that we need to be conscious of, we don't need, and I think the critique is a little too strong, but I've actually seen communists, they have been communists for years, they were union members. They say, well, Assad does this and this and this, and Syria is doing this and this and this, and they're good, because Baathism isn't so great, but it does this and whatever. And same thing with Gaddafi in Libya. Gaddafi was the best leader in Africa, but also he ran extradition sites for George W. Bush, and he also he was engaged in some pretty not good behavior, but whatever. But if during that time I would hear people on the left just say, oh, well, Gaddafi does this and that and this and that, and some of it was true, but what we need to actually focus on is we need to critically examine these countries and, one, not just jump on the, oh, well, that was bad, here's the news, we need to do this, but then also, and this is for the left, if there is such a thing, we also need to critically examine these people and not make everything great or everything bad, but we should say, look, Iran, the mullahs, they have communist blood on their hands. They killed the communists who were uprising. They are anti-communist. But when the U.S. is rattling sabers, which side do I here in the U.S. fall on? That's with Iran. But keeping in mind that, like, I'm not saying that the murderers of communists are gray. Does that make sense? Anyway, sorry.
You have a hand back there.
Yes.
So I think most of our panelists here would agree that the theory that Marx gave us was that, like, the mode of production, like economics, is at the basis of all social organization, right? So, like, class consciousness is more important than, say, national or racial or gender consciousness, at least for the purpose of uniting all of the people around the world, right? But that's something that's agreed among the panelists, because the question I'm asking is kind of building on this understanding. I don't think anyone has any issue with it.
I do, but I think you should ask your question.
Okay, right, then I'll ask the question. Then the question is, like, how do we ensure that in this leftist movement that should be carried out around the world, we distinguish between, let's say, because I think the issue of Iran and the issue in Hong Kong has one very important similarity in that right now we're being blinded from the class-based conflict because of other conflicts. In the case of Hong Kong, it's initially nationalism. There are a lot of mainlanders who believe that these Hong Kongers just want to go independent. They're either being fooled by Westerners, or they're moving to, or some of them, of course, just want to, create trouble. And it's a disgrace to the nation. So nationalism, the sentiment of nationalism is being brought in, even though, as Mr. Hui said, not all Hong Kongers are anti-Chinese or even want an independent Hong Kong, right? So, like, there's that element of non-class-based consciousness being brought in to replace class consciousness as a part of the movement, which allows opponents of, our movement for freedom to gain the upper hand. And in Iran, there's yet a similar issue, this whole, but in this case, I suppose religion is also involved because, in America, I was watching a Trump rally, I think this was just last night or the night before, during the Democratic debate. They had a rally in Iowa, I think. Like, here's Trump appealing to same, nationalistic rhetoric, like saying, these are terrorists, like, these are people who should just be killed. I mean, there's not a word mentioned about, like, how working class people are, like, the core issue here. Because, I mean, he says that there's a great, Iranian people, but, like, what does that mean? I think even Trump himself subconsciously realizes that, like, it's the masses, it's the working class, it's the majority of the people whose interests are being sacrificed for all these, struggles between great powers, or, like, nation state and these larger polities. These are just what Marx might call the superstructure, right? Like this is completely sham. This is not what a true working class based movement should focus on. So what would you propose to be a strategy to ensure that none of these other elements, like say nationalism or racism or like religion, are being mixed into a purely class-based movement? Or of course, unless you believe that these elements should be involved, but perhaps in a different way. I don't know if any of the panelists can comment on this.
It's always true that the ruling classes of any time cultivate ideas that sanctify their position in society and the relations in that society. And it's true in ancient China, it's true in Israel today, it's true anywhere you look, right? No class that dominates the places where ideas are produced and reproduced, whether it's the University of Chicago or grammar school on the south side that I went to, they want people who will reproduce that system. Maybe changes, but not challenges. Why do I say this? Because it's everywhere and every time these ideas, male supremacy, racism, nationalism, they're organic. They grow there. They're cultivated. So consequently, it's not like there's something pure that's being, what's the right word for this? Spoiled, ruined, dirtied. No, there's nothing pure. There is no pure class consciousness, because class consciousness is the one approach that threatens the whole structure of society and those on top, right? Because it will tear down all the institutions and we will rebuild it on a completely new basis. So consequently, my experience in life and my belief is that the task of a revolutionary organization is to work in concrete conditions and situations with people, because these ideas come up everywhere, all the time, in different things. I attended school here in '75 and '76, and the economics department was run by, what are their names again? These are the sons of bitches who
Friedman. Friedman.
Yeah, Friedman and he had a partner here. So we were protesting and trying to get him driven off. We wanted him to be thrown off of campus, not by the administration for administrative reasons, but because we wanted the students to oppose him, challenge him in classes, on campus, everywhere he went, because of his politics. So it's in daily life that these ideas that come up, they're there. So the role of a revolutionary organization is to expose them as harmful to the struggles of the people and to win people to the alternative, what you were discussing in terms of emancipatory, in terms of building new relationships, not because they feel good per se, but because it's the most creative way to get the most creative product, if you will, from all of us, because everybody has something to contribute. And so I think I would encourage you to look at it. It's like a natural phenomenon almost. It's not natural, but there are tens of thousands of people in the United States, if not more, whose livelihood is built around making sure that the textbooks are not too dangerous and don't have too many bad examples that would turn people against the system. And that's just textbooks. So I think that's how I experienced it when we were involved in anti-war or student struggles or organizing in the union or anything like that. These ideas come into play, and if you're class conscious, you try and explain to people. Like I gave a talk at a group of overwhelmingly white workers at a place before there was UPS, there was a Railway Express Agency. And there were thousands of people working there moving packages. I'll keep this, I know it's too long. So the short version is a group of black workers went out on strike on their own. No union authorization, no law supporting it. They just held picket signs demanding changes in the racist practices of management. Who got what kind of jobs, who got what shift they worked on, and so on and so forth. Now, the vast majority of the workers were white. So the question was, would they stay out of work without any union protection, without any legal protection, in support of the demands of the black workers, or not? So automatically the question of racist attitudes, no one says, I want to discuss racism, but somebody would say, I ain't going to do what those black people are going to do. Screw them. They're blah, 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 blah. And somebody else has to answer them, what are you, stupid? What they want isn't going to hurt you, and we can also bring forward things that will immediately affect all of us, whatever they are. So these things are inherent in the conflict. And the point of a revolutionary organization, in part, is to discuss how do we explain to our friends, our fellow workers, our students, or whatever, in this situation where these issues are raised and these are the ideas here, how do we unfold the links between that and the nature of capitalism and the potential for a new society? That's the job of a revolutionary organization. And an organization that professes to be revolutionary and wants to be revolutionary but doesn't engage in those struggles that are close to people's hearts is limited to university life. And I come from university life.
I just want to say I agree with everything he said, but I phrase it differently, and this is a good way to think about it. I'm a Marxist, right? Marxist-Leninist Maoist. Class is the key. That does not mean that race and gender and sexuality is not classed. Let's see. There's women in this classroom. How much do those women get paid for this exact same goddamn work that all the men would get paid? Depends on their race, depends on their education, but at its extreme, we're looking at 56%, right? That's women, that's economics. Women get paid less than men, and even if you're a highly educated white woman, you still make, I think it's like 89% of what an average a male white worker would make. That, well, why are you focusing on gender? Well, that's class. Because class, as Earl said, class is always gendered, it's always raced, it always has a sexuality. This is real and concrete. If you are trans, there is more likelihood you are going to die, you are going to be in poverty, you are unable to get economically, just pure economics, the jobs that you need to supply yourself. And, here's the thing. If we want to talk about race, go about 10 blocks west and you get to Elizabeth Street, where I used to live. You can look down the streets of Elizabeth, and it is indistinguishable from Iraq, from Baghdad, after the bombings. It's indistinguishable from Damascus in Syria. Why? Because it's mostly black people who live there. And economically, the capitalist class has a vested interest in keeping it that way. And so, it would be like, oh, damn, Whitey's holding me down. Yeah, I mean, I'm not advocating for that sort of superficiality, but to say that race and gender and nationality doesn't play a role is, despite sounding more Marxist than all of us who are concerned about that, I think is actually less Marxist in its understanding.
If I may add very quickly, I'll keep it to 1 minute. I also think that we can actually use forms of nationalism to actually fuel things like class conflict. Like, for example, there's in China you have 爱国退党, right? So it's precisely because you love your country so much. It's precisely because you love China so much that it demands you to engage in this type of class struggle. Because it is precisely those capitalists who are hurting your country, right? Is it not? Is it not those capitalists who stain the livelihoods of the nation? So we can use precisely this nationalistic rhetoric to turn people towards the side of class struggle, at least in my opinion and my limited experience.
So on this topic of nationalism, I wanted to point a question at Lou to elaborate a little bit more on what you were saying before. On the opportunities and challenges between imperialism and the international aspect of socialism. So, kind of talking about, like, you mentioned nationalism as potentially inciting class consciousness, but the entire, like, the Marxist slogan, workers of the world, this sort of, like, international thing. How does imperialism interact with this?
Yeah, I would agree that there is limitations of proposing what Marxists might traditionally call bourgeois demands. However, this isn't just to denigrate them. If we recall, the trade unions basically put forward bourgeois demands, but Lenin understood that Lenin and Luxemburg said that these trade unions are schools for socialists. So it's not one or the other. I would say that the time of nationalism as a revolutionary end-all be-all is over. If the French Revolution was a nationalist revolution, and yet still like a emancipatory thing in some way, arising out of feudalism, I think now, with the internationalization of, the entire economy, it points to, these national forms are actually inhibiting humanity, and even inhibiting, business for capitalists. Not that I am trying to help, capital export for, J.P. Morgan Chase or something. Right, we seem to be, with regard to nationalism, without a international socialist movement or an actual capital I international made up of various national parties, there really just seems to be a repeat over and over again of national bourgeois revolutions around the world. But all I can say definitively is that it points to the need for the workers of the world to unite. It points to the need of basically overcoming national political boundaries.
So I think that's maybe one part of the question, but the other thing I was trying to get at, but I don't think I phrased very well, was there's this idea of like, under capitalism, monopolies form, and there's one left approach, which is to break up the monopoly, and the other one is to overtake the monopoly. So does imperialism kind of present a similar situation in which if imperialism extended itself to its furthest extent and became like one nation in which one country subsumes every other, then is that the sort of stage in which you overtake that nation and there's an international aspect of politics? Like, is this the sort of like frame, or is this something completely different?
In a sense, I mentioned it very briefly in my talk, but this was kind of debated in the Second International. Kautsky, for example, had this idea of ultra-imperialism that, to put it quickly, imperialism might grow to such an extent that it would be far too costly to ever have another war, given the vast swaths of the earth that have been controlled. But Lenin points out that this is all, Kautsky proposes that this all happened under capitalism. In other words, that there might be no more economic anarchy if you had this ultra-imperialism. The problem is that who runs this ultra-imperialism. It's capitalist, not proletarian. One other thing I might add, maybe just to put an addendum on my answer to Earl's question, to me, is that the very taking of the state, of state power, to use the term, the dictatorship of the proletariat, is not itself the emancipation, is not itself socialism, but rather the next step, we might say, and that emancipation, that the dictatorship of the proletariat might be hyper-capitalist in a weird way, in the sense that it overcomes the need for labor overcomes the need for labor is if you could make that conscious, that would be something else. Right, so it's not simply if people who are in the working class became CEOs or something, then you'd have socialism or something like that. Does that kind of answer your question? I wanted to say something really quick too, just about what the proletariat is or isn't. I don't follow it. I don't approach it as a sociological category. It's not about people in certain tax brackets. At least for me, I mean, I think for Marx, it's more of it's a negative concept, and that the very formation of that there is class shows the contradiction of bourgeois society, which is supposed to be a classless society. I'll leave it at that, just for the sake of other questions.
Well, I want to ask, why are you wearing a mask?
I assume that's being addressed at me.
Yes.
People in Hong Kong, the Hong Kong protesters, I'm sure you've seen the pictures, they always wear masks, primarily because to hide their identity with the growing use of authoritarian software, social management. And
I think it is still present in a classroom in the University of Chicago in the United States, where mostly, like 95% of people here are American present.
Well, I want to keep it. I think we should keep it on this imperialist topic, but specifically why I'm wearing the mask is probably because of that fear, and also probably to at least have some superficial symbol of my solidarity with people still in Hong Kong.
I hold respect for all panelists, but I have to say that it is bothering me that there's also a narrative of anti-China or anti-Chinese communists that is very prevalent in, especially in the left academic campus, that is bothering me and many mainland Chinese students, because if you say China, they will really just relate to negative things that has been propagated on the media, in the daily talks, and also in this kind of discussions. It's not that I do not think that people should not have this kind of opinion. I'm just saying that opinions are not facts. And I want to say that there is no clear evidence of China building any naval ports right now along the Silk Road, the one belt, one road thing. I'm just here to express my opinion that I hope that different opinion can also be tolerated and not be diminished just because you have a strong belief in something. I appreciate Gregory, I'm not sure, for including even Maoism in the discussion of leftism, because there are many forms of imperialism and leftism. Lenin and Stalin would call them leftists, which many people would not agree nowadays. But it is still a fact that they are a derivative of the development of leftism and Marxism. I just here to make a point that I hope that leftism and the discussion of such can be more inclusive of opinions.
Was that directed to him? I wanted to respond, but I'll wait.
Yes, please.
I could really appreciate that your experiences, a lot of people at the university and a lot of people, period, in America will have negative opinions about China, and they really don't have factual basis for it. Because in my opinion, there has been over the last 10, 15 years an increased awareness in ruling class circles that China, in fact, is not just a win-win for them, but a real competitor. And so we're seeing more anti-Chinese propaganda, more emphasis on things. For example, the United States is hardly in a position, government, in a position to uphold democracy when in my opinion, it's a joke. It's a mirage. It's a fraudulent appearance the policies of this country are clearly run by the ruling class, people with huge monies and so on and so forth. But they point to the Uyghurs, and I'm assuming that the reports are reasonably accurate, and they're looking for all kinds of ways to build public sentiment towards greater conflict with China. China becomes what the Soviet Union was, will be the target, in my opinion. It's an ideological offensive that's going on in this country, and you're feeling some of the effects of it. In terms of the actual conditions in China, my understanding, I forget I was a mouse, that's not important. I think the reality is that China is a state-guided capitalist, fundamental relationships. The working class works, the surplus value is extracted, and it's controlled by alien forces. There are no forms that I'm aware of in China, in the working class, that has any input, power, say-so over the direction of policy, what's produced, how it's produced. The working class is excluded from that in practice. That's my understanding. Doesn't mean everybody's poor, doesn't mean everybody's unhappy, but I think that's the case. So that has nothing to do with socialism or emancipation. And every government has played an important role in the development of capitalism in their countries, the United States included.
If I can just respond. So yeah, let's talk about the Uyghurs. Just to say, you know, the people of China have to deal with the government of China, and I'm only saying this intellectually. I'm not starting a Facebook page and a solidarity group, but the Uyghurs in China are almost certainly being put in prison, prison camps, etc., etc., etc. However, and this is very key to know, why are they? Why is the Muslim minority in South West China? Why are they? First off, why is the Chinese government coming down on them now? And they say they're radical, but how did they get radical? Well, the PRC in the 80s was basically a road in which Muslim fighters and weapons went into Afghanistan. So the same people who are and I'm not, yes, I think it's sad, it's terrible, but it's important to note that here in the United States, the very same people who are complaining about, oh, this civil rights violations in China, I can't believe that this is happening, oh, they're oppressing Muslim minorities, are the same people who radicalized, armed them in the 80s. And it's similar, you know, if you want to talk about, you know, they talk about Iran, but yet not a word about Saudi Arabia, which is just as, if not more oppressive than Iran. And so I understand your distaste for most Americans, and most Americans are really bad at it. And their international solidarity is like a foreign term. So I certainly am sympathetic to that, but I just want to say there's concrete reasons for it, and we as Americans, so not you, but we as Americans should take responsibility for that and actually show some real solidarity, which may include like support or visual or whatever for supporters in Hong Kong. For me, it's not, and it's not anything that to say you were wrong. But here in America right now, the U.S. government wants us to say, oh, well, Hong Kong. But then that's what I asked you. Okay, what concretely can we do? There's nothing. The Hong Kong people are going to have to either be successful or they won't. And I really hope they are. But it's important that we as Americans, and if you are, I understand there's many international students, we should actually show solidarity against war, against our government. Again, I want to emphasize, the main enemy is always at home.
Why don't we,
Hi, James, I have a question about such a situation in Hong Kong. Like, first of all, what's your opinion with the Kong is that how much of the Hong Kong working class is the movement kind of has this leftist idea being like connected to you and reach out to you? Because I mean, in mainland China, there's also many leftists who's kind of hoping for the like the protesters to actually do something to the capitalists. For example, there's a lot of large capitalist groups in Hong Kong, like the Taiko Corporation, and also like Li Ka-shing, that like the billionaire. But however, many the leftists are disappointed that they done nothing to impose any pressure on those capitalists, but instead just do some and many of their actions are just bringing less damage to public poverty and such.
Sorry, I mean, like, my intention was not to monopolize the discussion on Hong Kong.
Just
I
go
guess
ahead.
that's all right. Okay.
Go ahead.
I assume some of you have heard of the leftist riots in Hong Kong in '67. It was a Maoist.
Don't know anything.
Okay, so Maoists during the Cultural Revolution, Maoists came over, tried to overthrow the colonial government. Short story. My opinion, I personally would not have supported it. The Cultural Revolution, I'm sure. I mean, probably as a result of my own like growing up in Hong Kong. I have a friend who was involved in that. I mean, one of my his elderly friend, he was involved in that. You know, he tried to beat up the Guaylo, you know, the foreigners. But then I would not personally not have supported it because I don't think the Chinese government at that time was truly emancipatory. It was very, very destructive. But then I'm sure you can dispute. But anyway, on this topic of why are the protests not as leftist as they could be, that's a task for us today. It's precisely to make this movement leftist, or at least for me. People are not. It's not like people are anti-leftist. That's why they don't hate the tycoons. You talk to any Hong Kong industry, it's like, oh yeah, Li Ka-shing is a piece of crap. We have to pay so much bloody rent. You know, up to 70% of your income is rent. You know, it's ridiculous. But then they simply think democracy is a more important issue at the moment. So I think it's our task precisely to make Hong Kong more leftist. So don't turn your back on it. And that's all I have to say.
I mean, has the movement made any connection to worker unions, to other working class, and trying to communicate and try to discuss them about it also?
In Hong Kong, the union movement, labor movement is extremely, extremely weak, much worse than the U.S. Like the union density for the private sector is like 10%, even less. So right now there's not much labor organization, so unfortunately that hasn't occurred. But then hopefully in the future, it's precisely because we struggle for it, such a base can be built.
Just as a side note, as a union member, as a proud Teamster, you're not as dense. Is 3% more than union density in the U.S.
Private sector.
Private sector.
Yeah.
Really?
Yes.
Oh, wow, okay.
Yeah. So I'm just saying.
And if I could add something, I just saw on Facebook, and that's something that I posted and shared. There are people in the protest movement now who are putting up sign-up sheets in public places for people to join unions, that they're making new unions, IT workers and all different kinds of things, precisely to try and bring people together as organized workers to become another force in the movement. My only friendly suggestion to you, instead of saying let's make the movement more leftist, I would say make it more working class. That's all.
One more question for Merlin, and then I think we're going to have to wrap up.
What should the approach, like the historical study of imperialism, be, particularly pertaining to like the Soviet Union? Like, how should we approach the question of like the Soviet Union's foreign policies and so on?
It's a doozy.
Yeah.
I guess it.
Well, that's just a 30-second response, right?
Yeah.
Mine is I would look to the relations of production, because if you look at, my father was a Stalinist. He thought that when Stalin got out of bed, the sun rose in the heavens, because it was tough, and he was working class himself, and he knew it would be a tremendous bloody fight. So I ended up rejecting those ideas, but it's partly because I interpreted the Soviet Union's actions compared to the U.S., they look better. They supported liberation movements in Africa. The U.S. was for counter-revolution in Africa, stuff like that. But the relationships at production, basically the working class, just as I understand it in China and certainly in the United States, is excluded from control over any questions of what is produced, how it's produced, when it's produced. the purposes in society, what should be the priorities in society, is effectively in the Soviet Union, the working class was separated. They were given a lot that wasn't true for other countries. There were material gains and social gains of all kinds, but in terms of the fundamental relations, the working class was excluded when people tried to. They were punished, right? And the Soviet Union's foreign policy actually undermined workers' revolutions wherever they took place, in my opinion. And that's not just in Eastern Europe. So to me, it says something about the roots. A consistent foreign policy from the at least early 30s on was, we want to have friendly relations with capitalist countries, especially of the West, and that comes from somewhere. It can't be separated from the class relations. I'm not a Trotskyist, but I like Trotsky's book. What's it called? It's basically a sociological analysis of the Soviet Union. Revolution Betrayed,
yeah.
right? So it's a long time ago. But if you take a look at it, I saw a description of society in which all the bourgeois ideology and relations of officers to soldiers, men to women, older to younger, and so on and so forth, it was all capitalist ideology, and I would say capitalist relationships, but they came in the form of what had been a workers' revolution. So to me, the most useful one is that there's a strong element of state capitalism. Others won't agree, but that's...
Well, as the other who doesn't agree, yeah. So social, the term that Mao uses to describe the Soviet Union post-Stalin is social imperialist. They're socialist in name, they're imperialist in action. What I actually think is, I do think the Soviet Union was social imperialist. It's just Mao got it wrong. What to say is, were they exercising good foreign policy? Were they supporting workers' revolutions in X, Y, and Z? Not really. Not in a thoroughgoing fashion. But then ultimately, to claim that they were just capitalists with different clothes. Well, okay. Where did Vietnam get all the MiGs from? Mm-hmm. Where did they get the AKs from? That had to be the Soviet Union. So I think that more nuance is needed. For example, the way that China is behaving in Africa looks great compared to the way everyone else has behaved in Africa. It's deplorable. If someone told me, oh, we're going to be a socialist country and we're going to have this policy, I'd say, well, talk to me when you're not so drunk and stoned, and then maybe we can discuss it, because it's bad. It's really bad, and it's bare scraping the very edge of the coffee can to get the last little bit to call China socialist in that respect. But as of right now, and I mean that in like historical sense, like maybe the last 5 to 10 years, China does provide a serious break on U.S. imperialism. As to a much lesser extent, so does Russia, and that's the best we're gonna get until we start building revolution here. I know that's a very unsatisfying and disheartening answer, and maybe you certainly disagree, and I certainly understand that, but it's what I think is the truth.
Okay, I think we have to wrap up.
Yeah, can I make a suggestion though?
Okay.
I mean, or it's like a question, but it could get rolled into closing remarks, perhaps.
Okay.
If that's cool with you.
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay, yeah. Well, my question is, returning to the theme of the panel and the recurring theme throughout the discussion about the strategy for the left reconstituting an international left. What are the next steps in the next 1 to 10 years? And what would that look like? What would a reconstituted left, what would it need to be? Lou seems to suggest what's absent today is an international mass socialist party. How would that change the context? Earl seems to suggest what's needed is international organizations with roots in the working class. Desmond is suggesting that there needs to be some kind, at the moment, there's just no connection between the discontents in the U.S. and the discontents in Hong Kong, other than perhaps, opposing Trump in the U.S. implicitly. Greg, you've actually been kind of more implicit on this front, but I'm assuming that, based on your slideshow, what you're looking to try and do, or what a reconstituted left would be some kind of protracted people's war involving a communist party. So if you could all clarify, how would these strategies relate to the reconstitution of the left, and how would that change how we would approach the question of imperialism? If you could wrap that into your closing remarks, I'd really appreciate that.
Should we keep it really, really short, since it seems like...
Yeah,
We'll have to be out of here by 9, right?
yeah. So, give a brief remark to that question, then we'll go ahead and wrap it up. Any of you can start.
I'll start. So I'm Maoist. There's a thing that's happening in the U.S. that Maoism is resurging, and I don't think it's a good thing. I think it's actually the failure of Occupy Wall Street, that anarchism as the predominant left ideology is basically dead, and Occupy Wall Street killed it. And so all the people who would be anarchists now want to still be anarchists, but they have to say that they're communist. And so that there's now this creation of protracted people's war. It is in Mao, but he's talking about rural countryside, and he's talking about actual warfare. Maybe protracted people's war is something that in the future we could do, maybe. I'm having a difficult time getting people at my work to go to the union meeting on Sunday. Okay, so me saying that, as opposed to, hey, let's go buy AKs and let's have we'll form a guerrilla cell off Ashland and start taking pot shots against cops. That's really not going to happen. The fact that they do believe in people's war, many Maoists do, and it's now just a cliche. If you're a Maoist in the United States, you believe in protracted people's war, which is really a good way of wearing a red handkerchief around your face and posing with guns that you put on Facebook. As far as what we can actually do, I understand the need to build international solidarity. I mean, it's the anti-war movement. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of the same material constraints that the anti-war movement had in its favor in the 60s and the 70s. But what I think is we need to do is constitute what we can, but also we should be clear about it. We shouldn't lie to people that oh, well, you went out to, I'm going out to the Iran protest, or the no war in Iran protest, so I'm going to stop the war in Iran. No, not at all. What you should say is, I'm going to this protest because I'm showing solidarity, and it's important to me that everybody knows that I am against my class, or my capitalists in my country, and I'm going to stand with my class against them. And I've said it a million times, and I'll just say it again. The main enemy is at home, which is very unsatisfying, and it's not good for all these plans of international relations, but it's true.
So, shall I? Very quickly, I mean, I don't have a complex model of how these things run, but then I would like to say one, resist all narratives that support any type of imperialist domination. You know, for example, false dilemmas, especially resist that. Just propagate any alternative to that. Do not fall into that trap. That's the main thing that we should be aware of. 2, do not turn your back on a movement simply because it is not working class enough. For example, Hong Kong. Sure, of course, it's not working class enough. Of course, it doesn't make any class struggle type of rhetoric. But then simply because of that does not mean you should turn your back on it. You should at least do not lecture the people, right? Teach them. Tell them, oh, of course, you guys want democracy. Well, what does that mean? Do you not realize that it means precisely revolution? So that's all I have to say.
I don't have necessarily a plan for building a mass socialist party in this country or any other, but I do know that it will require ideological clarity. I think that's one of the things that Platypus is attempting to do, at least in dealing with the ideas that the present has inherited. So what that might mean is that, if you want to have some, international solidarity, whatever that might mean, one must be very clear about what's happening. In Lenin's imperialism, he says that the fight to overcome imperialism is also tied up with the fight against opportunism. And so it's not simply a kind of fight the right thing, but that the left itself must know what it is, what it is itself. And without that, we'll just kind of be flailing around with different demands. Maybe I would just leave it at that. Greater, precise ideological clarity, and while at the same time going through what might be called principled adventurism, which I think is a term that I've heard the Socialist Party use. Beyond that, I simply know that my knowledge is, or the knowledge I have, it might be just negative knowledge then, in that sense.
I think that's a really good way to put it. I think it's a strength and a weakness. Negative knowledge, having the criticisms of everything that's gone before and that's going on now. I take that that's what you mean by it. The problem with it is that it's purely negative. This isn't directed at you.
It's okay.
But for example, the idea that nothing good came out of the 60s. Or you could fill in the blank. There are criticisms to be made of everything because we still live in a capitalist society. So there's been a failure to destroy capital relationships, the power of capitalism, and a failure, obviously, to replace it. In that sense, all we have is negative lessons. But I think the reality is that there are plenty of positive lessons that are good guidelines in which to explore. I don't know, what was the SP phrase you used?
Principled adventurism.
Principled adventurism. Yeah. So I think that there are positive things to learn, and not negative criticism is necessary, but to do it to the extent of not seeing the positives, which are partial but very real. The fact that black people in the South organized, had the wherewithal to stand up, where standing up meant being beaten, losing your home, losing your job, having your female relationships beaten or raped, being killed. That broke the oppression and the inertia of the 40s and the 50s, especially after the strike wave of the 40s. It broke it. It made the women's movement possible. It made the anti-war movement possible. It made the new communist movement possible. It made the growth of anti-imperialism among U.S. military personnel who sabotaged the war from within. They had Air Force analysts who were trained in language school to eavesdrop through the radio on the reports in North Vietnam to estimate what was the value of the bombing or what was bombed and what wasn't bombed. These guys, mostly men, lied to their superiors about the reports so they would misdirect the bombings. This is in the United States Army, the United States Air Force. Really, we should throw out that experience and say there's nothing positive there? That's just one example. So I think that's a problem I have with platypuses. Everything is bad. Nothing ever good came out of anything else. We alone have the torch. You know, great, make a wonderful contribution. But having this negative is not a path forward by itself. That leads me to my response to your questions. I don't know. But what I do know is take the ideas that you have and the understanding you have of society and how things change and get involved. Get involved, pick some practical or immediate or something that's an issue where you have people, you have an organization in countries all over the world. So there's one thing that's affecting every country in the world. It's called the climate disaster. That's one area. You want to get involved in something that is a worldwide issue immediately? I'm not saying it's the answer, but it's right there. It poses all kinds of questions. It's very clear, if you have a knife to see it, that capitalism is not and is most likely not going to stop this utter wave of destruction. And I won't go into a lot of reasons because everybody here is probably aware. How many people here think that capitalism can solve the climate crisis and the change in climate change? Can. Oh, good. Let's have a forum on that. Seriously. But I mean, that's a place where you can get involved from Germany to Jakarta. It won't make it. It's the same issue in different. It's the same shit in different locations. So get involved in it. Try and raise it from a perspective of emancipation, what it would take, and why this can't be done. Do something like that. Don't just hold on to negativity. You'll be irrelevant. And that's a shame.
I think we're going to have to wrap up, so please join me in thanking our panelists. I'd also like to thank the Black Student Union who helped advertise our event. Our reading group meets on Sundays in Harper 135 from 9:30. At 9:30, usually goes to around 12:30. So if any of you would like to come, we'd be happy to have you there. Besides that, thank you very much. You can get some PRs on your way out, and have a nice night.
Really, I'm serious.
I'm sure you have something to do with this. I don't know.